Get your hands off that, Grace. Who gave you permission to touch it? My daughter-in-law's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. Her hand came down hard on mine. The sharp crack echoed off the walls. The wooden spoon clattered to the floor, sending red sauce splattering across the white tiles in angry streaks. My son Deacon sat at the kitchen table, his eyes glued to his phone screen. He didn't even flinch, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge what had just happened. Tiffany glared at me with undisguised contempt, as if I were nothing more than a stray animal that had wandered into her territory. The bitter irony? This house was mine. Every brick, every beam, every corner, mine. I've told you 1,000 times not to interfere with things you don't understand, she said, crossing her arms across her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her designer blouse. I was just warming up the food, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Yeah, and you're ruining it, she snapped. You can't stay still for 5 minutes. You're not here to play chef, Grace. The silence that followed felt suffocating. My hand still burned, not so much from the physical strike, but from the humiliation that came with it. And there sat my son, scrolling through his phone as if his mother hadn't just been struck in front of him. Not a word of protest. Not even a glance in my direction. Not the slightest gesture of support. His silence cut deeper than her cruelty ever could. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a smile onto my face. You're right, Tiffany. I'm sorry. Oh, sure. I'm sorry, she mocked, rolling her eyes dramatically. Always so sorry. I bent down to pick up the spoon, and as I did, I caught my reflection in the polished floor. The woman staring back looked older than I remembered. Graying hair, deep wrinkles carved into her face, dark circles beneath tired eyes. It was like seeing a stranger who had been slowly disappearing, fading away one day at a time. But in that moment, something shifted. A spark, tiny and almost invisible, ignited somewhere deep inside me. Something that had been dormant for far too long. Welcome to Betty Stories. I share new life stories here every day, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit subscribe and give this video a like. Now, let's jump back into my story. I'm sure you'll love it if you keep listening until the end. Tiffany swept out of the kitchen with her characteristic haughty stride, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume that made my stomach turn. Deacon remained motionless, as if the scene hadn't involved him at all. I gathered what remained of lunch and scraped it into the trash bin. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a growing sense of helplessness I could no longer ignore. When they finally left for work, the house fell silent around me. This house where I had raised my son. Where my late husband Harrison had carefully painted every wall. Where every corner held a memory of better times. Now it all felt foreign to me, like I was living in someone else's home. Every laugh, every piece of furniture, every photograph, everything had changed. I turned on the radio to fill the oppressive quiet, but even the announcer's cheerful voice sounded hollow and distant. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the empty wall across from me. There was a small nail there, the only remaining evidence of where Harrison's portrait used to hang. Tiffany had taken it down months ago because she said it gave her bad vibes. She insisted the dead should stay in the cemetery, forgotten. Sometimes I wondered if she'd forgotten that I was already half dead too. That evening, as I washed the dinner dishes, I heard their laughter echoing from the garage. Deacon was laughing with her as if nothing had happened earlier. As if they hadn't just humiliated me in front of my own son. And then I remembered something my mother used to tell me when I was young. Silence is inherited too, child. If you don't speak up when it matters, your children will learn to stay quiet just like you did. I had kept quiet my entire life. I stayed silent when my husband first raised his voice to me. I stayed silent when I became a widow and had to raise Deacon alone on a seamstress's wages. I stayed silent when Deacon told me that bringing his wife to live with me would be temporary. I stayed silent when Tiffany began taking away my space, my authority, and finally, my dignity. But that day, hearing the sound of that wooden spoon hitting the floor, I understood with sudden clarity that my silence was coming to an end. I went to my bedroom and opened the nightstand drawer. Inside was a small red notebook, worn and faded, one I'd started writing in after Harrison passed away. On the first page, written in his familiar blue ink, was a message he'd left for me. If you ever feel far away from yourself, look in the mirror. I'll be there reminding you who you are. Tears streamed down my face, not from sadness this time, but from rage. Rage at myself for realizing I hadn't just forgotten who I was. I had allowed others to erase me completely. I closed the notebook with trembling hands and looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I spoke directly to my own reflection. No more, Grace. No more. The next morning, I prepared breakfast as I always did. Coffee, toast with butter, fresh squeezed orange juice. But as I moved through the familiar motions, my mind refused to stop working. I thought about Tiffany and the way she looked down her nose at me every single day, about her sharp voice calling me a useless old woman. And I thought about Deacon, about how my own son had become a complete stranger to me. When they came downstairs, the house smelled of freshly baked bread. Tiffany yawned without covering her mouth. Deacon turned on the television immediately. Neither of them greeted me. Neither acknowledged my existence. I placed breakfast on the table, poured the coffee carefully, and stood there watching them eat. Then, just for an instant, I imagined a different scene entirely. I imagined that same table, but with different expressions on their faces. Silent, shocked, confronted with something they never expected to see, something that would finally shut them up for good. That thought shot through me like an electric current. It wasn't hatred I felt. It was justice. The justice of a woman who was tired of asking permission to exist in her own home. Tiffany glanced at me sideways. "What are you staring at, old woman?" I smiled calmly. "Nothing, sweetie. Just thinking that tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day." She let out a mocking laugh, clearly not understanding what I meant. I smiled too, but inside, I was already making plans. Because I had learned something important that morning. When a woman like me stops being afraid, there is no one in the world who can stop her. It was Saturday morning, and the house filled early with sounds, smells, and activity. Tiffany had invited her work friends over for lunch, something I hadn't been informed about, of course. I discovered her plans only when she came through the door carrying multiple grocery bags, wearing that commanding expression she always used when giving orders. "Old woman, hurry up and clean the dining room table properly. We're expecting company." "Company?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. "You didn't mention anything." "Yes," she interrupted with that fake smile that always made my blood run cold. "My friends are coming for lunch. I want this house spotless. Understand? You could have told me sooner so I could prepare." "Don't worry about it," she cut me off again. "Just don't do anything without asking me first. You know how you are." Her words pierced straight through me. I pretended not to hear and began cleaning immediately. Deacon was still asleep upstairs. He'd been working night shifts lately, or at least, that's what he claimed. Though I was beginning to suspect his job was more fiction than fact. I spent the entire morning scrubbing floors, organizing rooms, and cooking everything she demanded. By the time her guests arrived, the house was gleaming. Tiffany fluttered around like a peacock, smiling brightly as if she were the queen of the manor. "And who is that?" one of the women asked, gesturing toward me with her chin. "Oh, her," Tiffany said with a dismissive laugh. "That's Grace, Deacon's mother. She lives with us. Poor thing needs the company, you know." "How sweet of you," another woman replied with exaggerated sympathy. "It must be so hard, living dependent on your children at that age. I offered a polite smile but said nothing. There was no need. Their pitying looks said everything their words didn't. During lunch, I sat in a corner out of the way, serving plates, bringing fresh napkins, refilling water glasses, doing what I always did. Being invisible. Tiffany spoke loudly, laughed even louder. She showed off the house, the new car, the landscaped yard. Every word she spoke felt like she was erasing my history. The history of the woman who had built these walls with her own effort and love. Grace, could you bring out the clean plates? Tiffany called out sharply. Yes, of course, I replied quietly, trying to maintain my composure. I went to the kitchen. The heat from the oven made the small room feel stifling. I carefully stacked the plates, one on top of the other, and carried them back toward the dining room. That's when I heard one of her friends say, Tiffany, I really admire you. I don't know how you have so much patience. I could never live with my mother-in-law under the same roof. Believe me, I wouldn't either, Tiffany replied, provoking a round of laughter. But Deacon insists. He says he'd feel guilty without her here. So I just figure, well, she can stay as long as she doesn't get in the way. The top plate slipped from my trembling hands and shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass was so loud that a heavy, humiliating silence immediately followed. Everyone turned to stare at me. Tiffany's eyes burned with rage. Always the same, she screamed. I specifically tell you not to do anything, and you mess it up every single time. I'm sorry, I murmured, beginning to bend down to pick up the broken pieces. Leave it, she snapped, roughly pushing my hand away. You'll cut yourself. You're not even good for that. The women looked down at their plates uncomfortably. No one said a word in my defense. Deacon, who had just come down the stairs, stopped in the hallway. He stood there watching the entire scene unfold. I looked directly at him, my eyes silently pleading for help. One word from him would have been enough. Just one word. But he remained perfectly still. His silence felt like a physical blow, harder than the humiliation itself. Clean that mess up and disappear, please, Tiffany said coldly. I don't want my guests to see you crying in here. I'm not crying, I replied firmly. And it was true. I wasn't crying. Something inside me had dried up completely. I stood slowly, carefully collected the broken pieces of the plate, and carried them to the kitchen. There, I dropped them into the trash bin one by one, listening to the sound each piece made as if they were fragments of my patience breaking apart. I leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a strange new calmness settling over me, something almost dangerous in its intensity. In the afternoon, after the guests had finally left and the house returned to silence, I was alone in the kitchen. The dining table was covered with empty glasses and scattered food scraps. I cleaned everything methodically, slowly, like someone cleaning up the ruins of a battlefield. On the floor, I found a single piece of the broken plate. It had a delicate blue flower painted on the rim. I picked it up and slipped it into my pocket. I'm not sure why. Perhaps to remind myself that not everything that breaks is lost forever. Sometimes, what is broken can also cut. That night, while Deacon and Tiffany slept, I went to the back storage room where I kept my personal belongings. I opened a cardboard box filled with old photographs. My wedding day, Deacon's birth, my early years working as a seamstress struggling to make ends meet. In one photograph, I was smiling broadly beside a brand new sewing machine, a gift from Harrison. Beneath the photo was a note he'd written in his careful handwriting. So you never have to depend on anyone, not even me. I ran my fingers across the faded ink. Those words hit me harder than any insult Tiffany could ever throw at me. I, who had worked my entire life with my own two hands, had somehow ended up asking permission just to breathe. I looked out the window. Moonlight bathed the backyard in silver light. The wind moved the curtains gently, and for just an instant, I felt Harrison's presence there with me, watching, reminding me of who I truly was. I sat down in front of the old sewing machine, the same one I hadn't touched in years. I ran my hand across its cold metal surface and carefully wiped away the accumulated dust. The metal felt like an awakening beneath my fingertips. "You know, Harry," I whispered into the darkness, "I think the time has finally come." I picked up a needle and thread, as if resuming an unfinished conversation with my late husband. The gentle hum of the foot pedal filled the quiet room, soft at first, then growing firmer, more determined. Sewing had always been my refuge. That night, it became my weapon. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do. I just knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't stay still while others decided my fate anymore. No more. The next morning, when Tiffany came downstairs, the familiar smell of fresh coffee greeted her as usual. But I was no longer the same woman. She spoke to me without making eye contact, ordering things in her typical commanding voice. I replied calmly, without hatred, without anger, only with quiet certainty. Because I had learned something new and powerful. When a woman discovers she can survive completely alone, she becomes more dangerous than any enemy. And I was just getting started. They say that when a woman stops crying, you should fear her. I didn't truly understand that until the morning I opened my eyes and felt something fundamentally different inside me, a calmness that wasn't sweet or gentle, but heavy and deliberate, settling in my chest and waiting. Breakfast was served as always. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own breathing. Deacon had already left for work. Tiffany, predictably, was still asleep upstairs. I sat at the table and stared into my coffee cup. Steam rose slowly from the dark liquid, like a thought forming and growing without any rush. And then I knew. It was time to stop reacting and start observing. I went to their bedroom while Tiffany was still sleeping. I entered without making a sound, moving like a ghost through my own house. The overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume made me slightly dizzy. On the dresser, among an array of luxury creams and sparkling jewelry, sat an open purse. Inside were envelopes containing cash, various receipts, a set of unfamiliar keys, and a small older model cell phone, the kind nobody uses anymore unless they have something to hide. I didn't touch anything. I only looked. Because what mattered wasn't what I saw, it was what she had been trying to conceal. I carefully opened the first dresser drawer. There it was, a folder containing bank documents. Deacon's name appeared prominently, yes, but underneath, printed in much smaller letters, was Tiffany's name as well. Shared accounts. Multiple loans I knew nothing about. Wire transfers. And at the very back, crumpled and hidden, a property sale request. For my property. My house. My stomach dropped. The date on the document was recent. Sale pending. The paper included a signature, supposedly mine. But it was forged. Completely forged. For just an instant, the floor beneath my feet seemed to shift. Rage rose from somewhere deep inside, burning through my chest. I wanted to scream. Wake Deacon immediately. Confront both of them. Tell them everything I'd discovered. But I didn't. No. Because I suddenly understood something crucial. The person who screams first loses the battle. And I had already lost too many times. I returned to my bedroom, locked the door behind me, and took out my red notebook. On the first blank page, I wrote a new phrase in careful letters. The person who doesn't value you in your silence will fear you when you finally speak. That would be my guiding principle going forward. I spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal. I spoke little. I smiled when appropriate. I served dinner exactly as I always did. But inside, everything had changed. Every gesture Tiffany made, every word she spoke, every movement, I watched it all, stored it away, analyzed it carefully. While they believed I was still the same submissive old woman, I was taking detailed mental notes. That night, I heard them arguing in the living room. Tiffany's voice was quick and nervous. "I told you to sign the document, Deacon. It's the only way forward." "I don't want to talk about this right now," he replied irritably. "Well, you should want to talk about it," she pressed. "We need that money. And your mother isn't going to live forever, you know." The silence that followed cut through me like a blade. From my bedroom, I barely dared to breathe. I heard footsteps, a door slamming, then the sound of the television turning on. Tiffany had locked herself in their bedroom. Deacon stayed in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. I understood then with perfect clarity. My son was trapped, caught between his own ambition, his fear, and his guilt. And Tiffany was simply waiting for the right moment to take everything from both of us. I didn't sleep that night. I thought. I planned. I wrote page after page in my notebook. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about teaching them a lesson, making them feel, if only for a brief moment, what I had felt for years. When the clock struck 3 in the morning, I opened my old sewing box. There, hidden among colorful threads and buttons, I kept the things Tiffany would never know existed. My property deeds, the original papers for the house, Harrison's letters to me, and an envelope containing his will. Everything was in my name, every single document, and they had no idea. I smiled in the darkness. Destiny sometimes has a curious way of balancing the scales. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I went to the local farmer's market, greeted the neighbors warmly, and returned home carrying fresh flowers. Tiffany looked at me strangely when I walked through the door. "What are those flowers for?" "To decorate the table," I replied pleasantly. "I want the house to look nice." "How unusual for you," she said with obvious disdain. "Yes, it might be," I agreed, smiling. Sometimes old women feel like changing things up a bit. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Distrust. Suspicion. Perfect. Doubt was my best ally now. I spent the rest of that day in silence, sewing in the living room. The threads intertwined between my fingers like the thoughts weaving through my mind. I planned every detail, every word, every gesture with precision. I wasn't an impulsive woman. I was a woman who had learned the immense power of patience. That evening, when everyone was asleep, I opened my red notebook once more and wrote, "Love without respect is servitude, and servitude is not love, it is fear disguised." That phrase became my final prayer before sleep came. At dawn, I made coffee and sat on the back patio beneath the Meyer lemon tree Harrison had planted 20 years ago. The wind rustled through the leaves with a gentle whisper, as if speaking directly to me. "Almost there, Harry," I told the morning air. "Everything is almost ready." I looked toward Tiffany's bedroom window. The curtains moved slightly, though I saw no one behind them. Even so, I smiled. Because something inside me knew that woman was no longer sleeping soundly at night. And that was just the beginning. Fear has a smell, something sour and thick, like old metal left out in the rain. For years, I had breathed that smell every time my daughter-in-law raised her voice or my son frowned in my direction. But that particular afternoon, when Tiffany's palm struck my face and the sound echoed sharply through the kitchen, I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt disgust. The blow came so fast I barely had time to react. The glass vase I'd been holding slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor, water spilling everywhere in a spreading pool. Tiffany glared at me, her face twisted with rage. "I told you not to touch my things, you nosy old woman." I brought my hand to my cheek. It felt hot and stinging beneath my palm. Deacon stood behind her, frozen with that same blank expression he always wore. "Tiffany, stop," he muttered weakly, without any real conviction. "Stop?" she repeated, spinning toward him. Your mother doesn't understand boundaries. I was just cleaning the shelf, I said as calmly as I could manage. Your perfume bottle had spilled. Liar! You always have excuses, she screamed. She shoved the ceramic vase that sat on the counter. It shattered spectacularly. The entire house seemed to shake with the violent noise. I said nothing. I just stood there, watching the broken pieces scattered across the floor, the water mixing with crushed flower petals. And in the middle of that chaos, I thought, this too shall pass. Because in my mind, there was no more room for fear. Only a very clear plan. I locked myself in my bedroom. My face hurt, yes, but what hurt far more was my son's complete indifference to what had just happened. I heard him argue with Tiffany for a few minutes, his voice raised but ineffective. Then I heard the car door slam, the engine starting, the sound fading into the distance. They had left together. I went to the mirror. My cheek was bright red, clearly marked by Tiffany's hand. I ran my fingers gently over my skin and saw something in my own eyes I didn't recognize at first. Serenity. Not rage. Not sadness. Pure, crystalline serenity. The kind that arrives when a woman knows with certainty that the end has already begun. I picked up my red notebook and wrote, They have stained my hands, but not with guilt. With memory. Because every blow, every insult, every moment of silence has become part of my story. One that will be written by me, not by them. That night when they returned home, I acted as if nothing had happened. I served dinner with a smile. Deacon wouldn't meet my eyes. Tiffany, in sharp contrast, wouldn't stop chattering about meaningless things, pretending everything was perfectly normal. I nodded politely, but my thoughts were miles away. In her every word, I saw the portrait of a woman who believed she had already won. And that gave me strength. While they ate, I observed their smallest gestures, their routines, their schedules, their tiny oversights and vulnerabilities. I took careful mental notes of everything. If I had learned anything during my long life, it was this. The person who underestimates a quiet woman always ends up losing the game. That night, after they fell asleep, I opened the drawer of the cabinet and carefully removed the documents I discovered. I spread them across my bed next to a lit candle. Shadows danced across the papers in the flickering light. My name. My real signature. And the forged one beside it. My house. My history. My dignity. It was all right there in black and white. I took a deep breath and touched the forged signature with my fingertips. My hand didn't tremble. Instead, I laughed. Yes, I actually laughed, silently to myself, because I finally understood something profound. They had ruined themselves. There was no need for me to scream or rage. I only needed to wait. The next morning when Tiffany came downstairs, I was in the kitchen making homemade bread from scratch. The sweet, yeasty scent filled the air throughout the house. She looked at me suspiciously. What's all this? Bread, I replied simply, continuing to knead the dough. Yes, I can see that. Why all the effort? To celebrate. Celebrate what? She asked with a twisted, mocking smile. The end of a season. She laughed sharply. Are you finally leaving, old woman? Are you finally going to leave us alone? No, I replied, my voice steady and firm. You are finally going to see me clearly for the first time. Her smile vanished instantly. She didn't say anything else. She just stared at me for several long seconds before turning and going back upstairs. I kept kneading the dough, humming a melody I hadn't sung in years, one Harrison used to play on his old guitar while I sewed by the window in the evening light. In the afternoon, Deacon returned from work. He walked straight to the dining room, saw me there, and sighed heavily. Mom, what happened yesterday was a mistake. Whose mistake? I asked without looking up from my work. Tiffany's. She's just nervous lately. She didn't mean to hurt you. She didn't hurt me, I interrupted him. He looked confused. Of course she did. She hit you. No, son. I carefully wiped my hands on a dish towel and looked him directly in the eyes. What hurts isn't the hand that strikes. It's the mouth that stays silent afterward. Deacon lowered his gaze immediately. For just a moment, I thought I saw genuine guilt flash across his face. But it didn't last long. Please, Mom, don't start this again. Don't worry, I said, smiling with perfect calmness. I don't plan to talk about it anymore. He seemed visibly relieved, not realizing that my silence was no longer surrender. It was strategy. That night, when the house fell into deep shadow, I went down to the basement. Among dusty cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, I found an old folder containing papers Harrison had carefully saved before he died. Invoices, insurance policies, notarized copies of deeds, everything in my name. I also found a sealed envelope addressed to me, one I had never opened. The paper edge was yellowed with age. I opened it with trembling fingers and read, Grace, if you are reading this, it's because I'm gone. I know what Deacon is like. We raised him with love, yes, but also with too much leniency. And that leniency made him weak. If he ever disrespects you, don't cry over it. Remember, the house is yours. The bank account is yours. You don't owe anyone anything. Promise me that if that day ever comes, you won't be the one to leave. You will make them leave instead. I love you always, Harry. I sat there in that dusty basement, reading those last words over and over until they burned themselves into my memory. And there, surrounded by boxes of forgotten things, I felt Harrison speaking to me from somewhere beyond time, giving me permission to do what I had to do. I climbed the stairs slowly, holding the letter pressed against my chest. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with flour and ink, yes, but I no longer saw them as weak. They were the hands of a living woman, a ready woman. Rest easy, Harry, I whispered into the darkness. It's almost over. Sometimes silence is the most perfect form of revenge. That entire week, I didn't argue with anyone. I didn't cry. I didn't complain. I didn't speak more than absolutely necessary. I only observed. And Tiffany couldn't stand it. It was as if her anger needed my reaction to feed itself properly. Not finding that reaction, she began to crumble from the inside. Deacon, meanwhile, grew increasingly confused. I greeted him every morning with a genuine smile. I made his favorite breakfast. I asked how he'd slept. It was the same routine as always, but something fundamental in my tone had changed. I was too kind, too serene, and worst of all, completely sincere, because there was no resentment left in my voice, only peace, and peace in a house full of guilt becomes absolutely unbearable. On Thursday morning, I woke earlier than ever before. The sunrise painted the sky a pale, delicate orange. I turned on the radio softly, made fresh bread, scrambled eggs with herbs, and squeezed oranges for juice. I set the table with meticulous care, bringing out the embroidered linen tablecloths my mother had made by hand and the fine porcelain plates we only used on Christmas. Every movement was a silent declaration of something. When they came downstairs, they both stopped dead in their tracks. Tiffany frowned deeply. What's going on here? Nothing special, I replied, smiling warmly. I just wanted to make you both a special breakfast. Why? She demanded suspiciously. Because you never know when it will be the last time we share a table together. Deacon stared at me strangely. Tiffany let out a sharp, nervous laugh. Are you feeling all right, old woman? Better than ever, I said simply. They sat down slowly. I poured the coffee with a steady hand, and as I watched them eat, something inside me finally settled into place. For the first time in years, my hands weren't shaking. Not even when Tiffany looked at me with eyes loaded with suspicion. After breakfast, Tiffany left for work. Deacon remained in the living room, visibly restless.
"Mom," he said, rubbing his hands together nervously.
"Why are you acting so weird?"
"Weird."
I asked without stopping my table cleaning. "I'm just trying to be at peace with myself." "But yesterday you said you wanted to talk to me about something important."
"Yes, but it's no longer necessary."
"What do you mean?" "I mean that some things are better understood when they aren't explained, son." He watched me with obvious discomfort, a knot forming in his throat.
I could see the doubt in his eyes.
The fear. And behind the fear, the guilt. Because Deacon knew, even if he wouldn't admit it, that something had changed forever. In the afternoon, I went into town. I walked down the familiar streets, greeting neighbors with genuine warmth, buying flowers from the corner stand as if it were any normal day. But it wasn't normal at all. I went to the bank first. Then to the county clerk's office. I handed over specific documents. I signed others with my full legal name. The clerk, an old friend of Harrison's, looked at me with concern in his eyes. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Grace?"
"More than I've ever been about anything," I told him firmly.
"Your son won't understand this decision." "He doesn't need to understand it," I replied. "He only needs to live through it and learn from it." I left the municipal building with my heart feeling surprisingly light. The air smelled of wet earth, as if the sky itself knew something was about to be washed clean. That evening, I cooked Deacon's favorite meal, slow-braised beef stew with root vegetables. He arrived home exhausted. Tiffany was in a foul mood as usual. Dinner passed in near-complete silence. When we finished eating, I cleared the table methodically and said, "I won't be home tomorrow."
"And why is that?"
Tiffany asked sharply. "I have important business to attend to." "What kind of business can an old woman possibly have?" she scoffed.
"The business of her own life," I replied, looking her directly in the eyes.
She tried to respond with something cutting, but something in my tone stopped her cold. Deacon pretended not to hear the entire exchange. I went upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door firmly behind me. My red notebook sat on the small table. I opened it to the last blank page and wrote, "When respect is broken, it cannot be repaired with words. It can only be repaired with actions.
And tomorrow I will act."
I turned off the light. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in years, without nightmares, without fear. The kind of sleep that only comes when a woman stops expecting to be treated with love and starts treating herself with dignity instead. I woke before dawn the next morning. The sky had that grayish-blue tone that announces truly important days, the ones that change the entire course of a life without making any sound at all. I dressed calmly in my best clothes. I combed my silver hair. I made coffee with steady hands. I felt no rush whatsoever. Because when the soul has finally decided what it's going to do, the body simply follows.